Hi, this is Barry with Simplicity Zen. Today, I'm honored to have Roshi Al Rapaport with us today. Hello, Roshi.
Good afternoon.
Um, so, Roshi Al Rapaport is the head teacher of the Open Mind Zen in what town in Florida again?
Melbourne, Florida.
Melbourne, Florida, where they do in-person training, when COVID allows, and he also was pretty early adopter of online Zen training. Is that the basic gist of it, would you say?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay. So kind of diving in, could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and so forth?
I grew up in Long Beach, California, and lived there until my early 20s. And so that was my primary influence growing up, was kind of the beach town environment in Southern California.
Were you a surfer?
I was, yeah. Wasn't everybody?
No.
No.
I hung out with the surfers. I didn't actually go to the water.
I was a surfer for a few years in my teenage years, let's put it that way.
And did you grow up in a single family home? Two parents, siblings?
Yeah, two parents, single family home. Parents fought all the time, but that was pretty typical for that era. I have two brothers and a sister, and had a pretty, I would say, fairly typical upbringing for that era, for the late 50s, early 60s.
And did you? So were you a teenager in the late 60s at all?
Yeah, well, I was born in 1953, so I was in high school up until 1971. So yeah, I was throughout the late 60s.
Did you have any encounter with hippie or counterculture society at all? Was that part of your experience?
Yeah, to some extent. Well, I mean, everybody did in that era. It was in the news. It was kind of on people's minds. There was a lot of fervor to change the dynamic that had happened in the 50s and early 60s. So, of course, there was influence to that effect. But where I grew up was not a particularly liberal area. I mean, Long Beach was kind of a working class community, blue collar street I lived on. We grew up fairly, low income. And so my first real experience with things like that happened when I was 17, and I started meditating. I started doing yoga from books because there weren't any teachers around there that I knew of. And then after that, I kind of, started exploring some of the counterculture stuff that was going on.
How did you know that kind of world even existed? Yoga and meditation and so forth.
Well, that's a good question, because it was harder to get information in that era if you lived in a place like I grew up than you might think. If you walked into the average bookstore then, there might not be any books on yoga or meditation, for instance, which is hard to believe based on anyone that actually goes into bookstores these days, or if you were to do a search on Amazon for those topics, you get so many that your eyes would glaze over.
Right.
In my case, I was kind of looking for something different because of I was going through a very difficult time psychologically when I was 17, and I was kind of searching, I think, for something. And I found some books on yoga in the library, and from those books on yoga, some of the early yoga books had instruction on meditation as part of the yoga practice. And so I started doing it, and then little by little found other books. But at that time, I was getting them all through the public libraries around that area, because that was the only place I could find them.
Was your angst as a teenager, was that just like normal teenage angst, or do you think it was?
Yeah, it depends what you call normal, but I don't know. It's hard to say what's normal or what was normal. I think that for me, it was there was you could say, a karmic connection with Buddhist practices and Hindu practices, certainly with meditation practice, because as soon as I started doing it, I right away felt connected to it and felt it was valuable. So it didn't take long, like a few times of meditating actually. And before that, I'd had zero exposure to that.
Did you, so I guess maybe to contrast normal teenage angst and maybe, like your typical teenager is like, my parents suck, work sucks, I don't want, stuff like that,
Uh,
versus some people at a younger age, start to, kind of have deep existential questions, or sometimes they'll even have like some sort of spirit, mystical experience. Like, would you say it was in one category or the other?
yeah, I wouldn't put it in the typical teenage category the way you just the way you lay it out there. What really got me questioning is I fell in love and didn't know what to do about it and couldn't really work with it
Hmm.
and couldn't deal with it essentially and
Hmm.
uh, went into, I think looking back on it now, kind of depression about that, and
Hmm.
but then started casting about for some way to handle it, and that's when I, so there was a questioning going on, but I think it was that originally it was a questioning of how to feel better.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't really drink. I wasn't really doing drugs at that time to speak of,
Hmm.
and so I didn't resort to those things, which is probably good.
Hmm.
But the more existential questioning happened when I started meditating and having experiences occur that were in line with what they were describing in the books, and so that kind of got everything rolling.
And this was all on your own at this point?
Oh, totally,
Yeah.
yeah.
What?
I started meditating in 1970, and I didn't meet a teacher that I connected with until 1975, and that's when I met my first Zen teacher.
Hmm.
Previous to that, I did uh, I did some traveling on the west coast of the U.S. and various communities I encountered, teachers that I encountered. I didn't really connect with any of them.
What kind of communities were those?
Kind of more what you call alternative, hippie, communal type places.
Hmm.
Some of them would have kind of a charismatic leader,
Hmm.
uh, and I would observe these people and see what the community dynamic was, and none of them really drew me in.
So you would go there, you would like go there and live there for a little bit, just kind of checking out the scene.
Yeah, yeah, just traveling and as a guest.
Mhm. Did you ever make it up to that one, when you were saying that, it kind of made me think of that Ananda community up near Nevada City. Did you ever go to that one?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, I didn't really hear about that place until many years later. It's important to understand that back in that era, and most of the traveling I did was in the early 70s,
Hmm.
uh, that it was hard to find out things. I mean, it wasn't like you could just do a Google search and everything would be laid out. Some places were hard to find, and you would have to really, run into someone that knew about them, or maybe there'd be a flyer somewhere in a bookstore or something like that. That was kind of how most people found out about things in that era.
Hmm. Yeah. And what kind of meditation techniques did you learn on your own? Was it breath counting or
uh,
visualization?
well, the first 5 years before I met Kozan Roshi, my first teacher, I was doing what I would call uh, Kundalini meditation, not formal Kundalini, but again, some of the things I read from some of the yoga books, and also some texts that I read later on. So it was more, I would say, not in a Buddhist, but more in a Hindu vein, if you want to call it Hindu.
Hmm.
Uh, and It involved visualizations and mantras and things like that primarily. That's what I did the first 5 years. And, also working with the breath to some extent.
Hmm. Kind of doing the Kundalini style practices where you having like energetic eruptions type of. You
Hmm.
said you had interesting experiences. Were they kind of in that
Yeah,
category?
yeah, all kinds of different energetic experiences, all kinds, and some experiences of the spacious quality of mind, and beyond the self experiences. Although at the time I didn't really know what they were. You don't have to know what they are intellectually, but it kind of helps if it happens within a practice format. or traditional practice format, I feel. And then I also was experimenting with psychedelics, with magic mushrooms and peyote, and a few times LSD, and had some pretty powerful experiences with those
Mhm.
chemical agents early on.
What was the context of the psychedelic drug exploration? Was it just with friends, or were there more kind of serious
Yeah, it
organized
was
groups?
primarily with friends, a few times by myself even.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, and it wasn't directed. It wasn't directed in a direct. It wasn't directed by a guide or anything like that.
Hmm.
Like I would recommend, if anyone does anything like that, I would recommend they have a guide because of the things that can happen.
Hmm.
And I had some amazing experiences, but I felt it also imbalanced me in a certain way. So, and that can be quite dangerous.
Did you go into all this with any sort of childhood religious upbringing, or were you an atheist? What was the
Very
context?
little. I grew up, my family was Jewish, but almost no actual religious Judaism at all. Um, I had a few experiences when I was young, looking back on them, that I think were what I would call visionary or spiritual experiences, but there was no way to really there was no way to really integrate it or talk to anyone about it back then that I knew.
Mhm.
And so it kind of got buried, and a lot of memories of some of these things came out later through the meditation process.
Mhm. As you're moving from teenage years into adulthood, did you go to college? Did you go straight to working? What was your life like at that time?
I did go to college, but I only finished a couple years of college, and then I started working.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So eventually you met your first Zen teacher. Could you tell us who he was and how you met him and what those early experiences were like?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, at that time, I had a friend. His name is Shenzhen Young. He's pretty well known mindfulness teacher now,
Yeah, I'm familiar with him.
and I had known him for a few years before I met that teacher, and he had trained in Japan years before that, gone there to work on his doctorate, and ended up becoming a Zen monk back in I'm going to say the mid late 60s, maybe late 60s. I met him, years after that when he'd come back to the States. And so I knew him for a few years, and I'd moved away from California for a while. And then on a trip where I was visiting family, I hung out with him one evening, and he said, "Do you want to come over and meditate?" Because he knew I was a meditator. "You want to meditate with this Zen teacher that I met in LA?" And so I said, "Sure." So we went over to his house, and for the first time in my life, I felt a very powerful connection to a person as my teacher. I didn't know anything about Zen to speak of at the time. I think the only thing I knew about Zen was reading Alan Watts' book on Zen, which I'd read years before that. I didn't, and what I knew about meditation was just what I'd practiced previously. I didn't really know any Japanese, and he didn't speak English, so we had to deal through either Shenzhen, who spoke fluent Japanese, or his translator. Um, but I had an immediate connection with him, and I decided, I was living in Colorado at the time, and I decided to move back to the LA area so I could study with him, which I did.
Was two questions. What was the context of meeting Shenzhen? Was it someone you just randomly knew socially? You guys
Yeah,
start
good
talking about
question.
meditation, or
Yeah, good question.
yeah.
Uh, it's a long story. I don't want to get into all the details about it,
Mhm.
but because it would be an hour-long interview just about that.
Okay.
But basically, I met him through a mutual friend who was, I guess I would call her a healer.
Hmm.
That'd be about the best way I could describe it.
Hmm.
And I met him one day at her house, and we became friendly with each other. And then I visited him at the center that he was staying at in LA, the International Buddhist Meditation Center. It was Thich Thich Annan's center.
Hmm.
And he kind of, at that time, I believe he was running the retreats there and things like that. So I did some retreats at that place before I really met my first Zen teacher.
And your first Zen teacher, was he Soto or Rinzai or
He was a
Sanjapa?
Rinzai teacher. He was only in the U.S. about a year. He was actually traveling here. I'm not sure. to be honest, I'm not 100% sure why he was in the U.S. I think that it was partly travel. He was, I believe, 62 years old when I met him. I think he was 62. He'd been traveling up in Northern California for about half a year. And then when I met him, he had been in LA, and he actually lived in South Central LA in this little house with virtually nothing in it. And with his translator, who was, when I say translator, he was also, I think he had a relationship. I know he had a relationship with her too, but they were traveling together and settled in LA for a while. For what reason, I don't know. And that's when I met him, when he was there in LA, and he was doing sesshin out of the house there. So yeah, he was a Rinzai teacher, definitely.
How formal was their practice? Was there like choka morning services and bowing
No.
forms and
Well,
stuff?
I would say it was formal in certain respects. The sitting was quite formal in terms of the way we did it, and there was a lot of it. But I don't remember. I remember there was some chanting, but very little. There was no way to do it because no one else there, I don't think, knew how to do the ceremonial things, and he wasn't really that much into that. So when we did sesshins, retreats, for instance, I think we started sitting about 5 or 6 in the morning. It was quite early, I know that, until like 9 at night, and with a few breaks, meal breaks, rest breaks, and he would do like a 15-minute talk every evening, and that was about it. Otherwise, there was no talking. There were no services. There was very little going on other than the sitting. And the sitting happened in the house. What was that?
I'm sorry. Would he wear his robes or
he wore robes. Yeah, he wore robes all the time of one sort or another. Yeah.
And
But
was
we
there
were all lay
dokusan?
people. None of us had robes.
Was there any sort of dokusan or one-on-one
Yeah.
contact with
Yeah,
him?
there was regular interviews. It was really a typical Rinzai style. He started me right out on koans pretty quickly. And the first 2 koans that we use in our system now were koans that are unique to our school because they come from him.
So they weren't Mu. It wasn't
and
Mu.
those were the first 2. Yeah, before Mu, actually, he would give the first koan he would give is where's the dividing line between east and west? That was the first one, and the second one is how do you walk? Those are the first 2 koans, and then he gave you Mu right after that.
And did you have kind of more informal talks? Did you like try to tell them about the experiences you had earlier or anything like that?
Yeah, to some extent, a lot of times when it wasn't retreat, we would sit around when he had sitting in the evenings. I wasn't able to get there all the time because I was staying out in Long Beach area, Seal Beach, Long Beach area. So it was a bit of a drive to get in there. And for the first month I was there back in Southern California, I didn't have a car, so I had to take buses, and that was really difficult. After I got the car, it was easier. But I was going there, I think, a couple times a week on the average, and those were more casual things where we would kind of hang out. And I tried to spend a fair amount of time with him. He was available, and we would talk through the translator. And I would describe to him some of the things that I'd been through, but he wasn't. He was kind of interested a little bit, but if I would get into too far out there with some of my experiences, he would just bring me back to something simpler.
Did he have like? Was there anything about his bearing or just kind of his vibe that was intriguing or resonating with you?
That resonated with me?
Yeah,
Yeah, everything.
I mean, a lot of times, I know from personal experience, kind of sometimes what draws you into a teacher isn't so much what they say; it's just their vibe and their bearing
Right.
and their
Yeah, that was definitely the case here because I couldn't converse with him, except through a translator, and so it was pretty. And he wasn't like long-winded, so the conversations you'd have with him would be pretty short. But and this was kind of a funny story. But the first time I met him, I think we were there for an evening sitting, and when I got there, I heard shakuhachi flute. I didn't know what a shakuhachi was at the time, but I heard flute music coming from the back. So he was in the bathroom sitting on the toilet playing his shakuhachi. And when Shenzhen told me what he was doing, it really cracked me up. I thought it was hilarious. And that was my introduction to him, kind of an unself-conscious person.
Mhm.
But yeah, he was really a kind of typical, very strong samurai type Zen person, very Rinzai samurai style, and and at the time that really drew me in.
Was he elderly?
He was 62, but he was in amazing condition. I mean, you would have never guessed. He was very vital, yeah,
Mhm.
very strong for his age, I think.
Mhm. Any other interesting stories or recollections about him?
Uh, well, uh, he was could be pretty severe. I saw him break a kyosaku, a pretty strong kyosaku, over someone's shoulder once. That he was really being tough with, but I didn't have any money to speak of at the time, very very little. And when I became a student, there's a traditional ceremony in Rinzai Zen, I think also maybe in Soto, I'm not sure, but where you do a little ceremony to become a student,
Mhm.
and then you make an offering to the teacher. And normally in a case like that, it would be a financial offering of some sort. But I didn't have hardly any. I had $10. Period. I mean, when I say that, I mean I had 10. That was it. I didn't have more in a bank account somewhere. And that was what I was going to get me home, because I was coming by bus then.
Mhm.
So I didn't realize I was going to have to make an offering. No one told me that in advance, but his translator said it while I was in the room with him. And so I gave him the $10 I had. And then later on, someone told him that was the last, all I had was $10.
Mhm.
And I wasn't, I left that after whatever it was we were doing. Maybe it was a retreat or something. I'm not sure. I think it was just a day long thing. And I was going to have to hitchhike home, and I was going to have to walk through South Central LA
Mhm.
to get to where I could hitchhike. It was kind of dangerous for a white guy at the time.
Mhm.
And as I was leaving, he came running out to the porch, and he was waving the $10 at me, saying, "Here," he gave the $10 back to me, which I thought was really cool.
Mhm.
It kind of made me tear up. Kind of makes me tear up when I think about it, because
Mhm.
he was just there to teach, certainly not for money or fame or anything like that. He never became well known. He was never well known.
Mhm. How did he support his lifestyle? Through donations of his students? Like, how
I
did he have the
don't know.
houses?
I actually don't know. I'm not 100% sure about that. Shenzhen might know. I've never asked him, but I know that some of the people there were in a better circumstance than I was financially, and I'm sure they gave him some money. And it's possible the temple that he was from in Japan supported him to some extent too.
Mhm.
Uh, so, yeah, that's the only information I have about that.
Do you know? Do you know what Rinzai branch he was in? Was it Myoshinji or any of those?
Uh, Yeah, it sounds really bad that I don't know more,
No,
but
I
because
mean
I
you were
was so
young.
young at
But
the time and I didn't
yeah.
know what I was doing, and he left
Mhm.
after I only spent 4 months with him, or 5 months with him, before he left, maybe half a
Mhm.
year. I can't remember exactly how long.
Mhm.
Uh, but I found out that because I saw pictures of him training in Japan, he was, and I didn't find this out until fairly recently, because I met an American who spent time in Japan and became one of these Kamuso monks. They're the ones that have the big reed baskets over their head and play the shakuhachi flute as they're going into town begging for alms.
Mhm.
Um, so I saw pictures of him doing that in Japan, and so he may have been in that particular branch of Zen,
Mhm.
uh, or that could have been earlier in his life. I honestly don't know exactly.
Mhm.
I'm not sure about that.
Mhm. And so your relationship with ended because he just left town.
Yes, yeah, and I never saw him again. I corresponded with him a few times after that, but never saw him after that. Uh, I had actually just gotten back from Japan about a year before I met him,
Mhm.
and if I'd had money, and maybe if I'd have spoken more Japanese, I could have I might have gone to Japan to continue studying with him. But it was, in that era, it was harder traveling. It was more expensive, and you had to have money to do it. So
What had brought you to Japan? Was that just a vacation?
It was kind of part of my wandering phase that I did in the early 70s.
Hmm.
I
Did
spent
you?
about a month and a half there. It
Did
was funny because I didn't know anything about Zen when I was in Japan. I did meet a German man who I spent time with over a few weeks, and he had just gotten out of a monastery where he'd spent like a year training. I don't know what monastery, but it was somewhere in Kyoto, I believe.
mhm,
And so he would tell me about the kind of training he did and all that. But I wasn't really interested in Zen much at the time. I'd
mhm.
always wanted to, I was always kind of fascinated by Japanese culture. And so I traveled there. I was living in Hawaii and I traveled there because I found a cheap ticket and spent a month and a half there. But I met my first Zen teacher in Los Angeles, not in
Right.
Japan.
Yeah. Did you visit the big Kyoto kind of museum like Tipples at all when you were there?
uh, I don't know which one you're talking about. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, there's like Myoshinji and
oh,
Tofuguji and
yeah.
things like those.
Again, I didn't know anything about Zen at that time, so I wasn't looking for Zen temples, but I visited a lot of temples in Kyoto to the point at which I got sick of them because there's so
Right.
many. I mean, they're everywhere.
Uh-huh.
And what I generally did is I would just walk around in the hills and I'd run into places, and I don't know what they were called even, but there were a lot of temples I visited.
Hmm.
Just I did go to Ryoanji, the one with the famous rock garden, because I
Hmm.
remember that I'd heard about that from somebody.
Hmm.
Uh, wasn't terribly impressed at the time because I didn't know what I was looking at.
Hmm.
So I was, again, I was totally uneducated about Zen when I was in Japan.
Hmm. So you're in LA, your teacher left. What was next for you then?
Yeah, it was tough for a while because I was so connected to him, and then when he left, I didn't know what I was going to do.
Hmm.
Um, and so uh, I spoke to Shenzhen about it again because we were still in contact, and he had been studying with Kozan also during that time.
Hmm.
And he told me that he was translating for Joshu Sasaki Roshi, who had a center in LA called Cimarron Zen Center.
Hmm.
Uh, so I went there and checked him out, and I used to go there and sit I think it was on Sundays when they had their main sitting when they were open to the public. And
Hmm.
then I ended up doing a retreat a few months later, or maybe half a year later or so, at Mount Baldy Zen Center with that group. And but Sasaki Roshi, I was drawn to him a little bit, but there were other things that really bothered me about him, and so I decided to stay away from him and that community.
Hmm.
And then Shenzhen, again, it was Shenzhen that introduced me to LA Zen Center, and that's where I kind of dialed in and connected somewhat.
That's
For,
Maezumi Roshi.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, although it wasn't really so much Maizumi that drew me in.
Hmm.
It was more Genpo Merzel, who was just become a sensei. I'm not even sure he was a sensei then. I think he was. Uh, but when I first got to LA Zen Center, uh, uh, Maizumi and Bernie Glassman Sensei were in Japan, and they had kind of left Genpo in charge, and so he was the one who I was first introduced to, and he grew up in the same town I did. I think he's about 8 years older, 6 or 8 years older than I am.
Hmm.
But we grew up in the same town. We knew some of this. He went to the same high school I did,
Hmm.
and so we kind of connected through that, and also just in terms of the vibe, I connected with him and early on. And then when Maizumi and Bernie Glassman came back, I met both of them and did interviews with them also, but never really connected with either one of them as much as with Genpo.
Interesting. Were you were you like working and living and just showing up for events, or did you ever move to Los Angeles Zen Center or anything like that?
At first, I was living in Long Beach and coming to events. I did a session there, I think, in late 77.
Hmm.
And after doing that week-long session, I decided I really connected to the fact that there was a community there. At that time, there was maybe 80 or 90 people as residents there.
Oh
And I
wow.
was kind of approaching the height of their residential program before it all fell apart years
Was this
later. And
mid 80s or early 80s or?
uh, well, as I said, the first retreat I did there was in late '77, and then I
Oh,
moved
okay.
there. And I moved there in early '78, I believe.
I see. Oh, okay. So.
Yeah, so I decided I was gonna. What I did is they had a 3 month training program, so I joined that training program
Hmm.
and did 3 months, and then uh, all my money was gone, or most of my money was gone, and they took me on staff at that point because they felt that I was a promising student, I guess, and I was really willing to work. So
Hmm.
I spent about a year on staff there doing different jobs, maybe a couple of years. I can't remember right now the exact time frame. And I stayed there until early '82.
Was when you first met Genpo, was he transmitted yet, or was he kind of an assistant teacher with you?
Uh, it's a good question, and no, he didn't have full transmission. I know that for sure because what Maezumi did with his early students that he gave transmission to is he took them to Japan, brought them around, introduced them to his family and to some of the other teachers he'd worked with, um, and then they did the traditional Soto Zen week long, or maybe it was a month, or I can't remember the exact amount of time at Eiheiji, where
Mhm.
they would have to do, they would become the abbot for a week or something like that. It's called the Zuisei ceremony, I believe.
Yeah, Abbott for the
And
night or the
so
day.
when I first came to LA just to live at the center, Maizumi was in Japan with Bernie Glassman Sensei doing that
Mhm.
and
And
traveling around.
Bernie was his first air, right?
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not even sure Genpo was officially a sensei at that point. I don't think he was, but I think after Maizumi came back shortly after that, he was.
Hmm.
But don't, I'm not 100% clear on
Right, right.
that. He was just in charge when I got there, and he was the one doing interviews.
Hmm. So you did Koan Dokusan with him?
Hmm.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, I did. I did. Yeah.
Hmm. And did you start from the beginning of their curriculum, or did you kind of
Well, I
pick
was
up?
still when I first got there, I was working on Moo, so I was basically practicing Moo and doing
Hmm.
interviews on that.
Hmm. Was there a lot of explicit talk about Kensho, or was it just implied, or
Uh,
what was the
yeah,
yeah?
yeah, it was kind of big on everyone's mind, I think, in that era, especially. Um, the main book that everyone had read, there weren't that many Zen books in English at that time, and one of them was Three Pillars of Zen,
Right.
which probably uh, Zen mind beginner's mind also, but because the practice there, although it was a hybrid practice that Maizumi had really uh, developed, and or some of it was from some of his previous teachers, but I think he altered things for the U.S. market, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, Even though it was ostensibly the transmission that he offered was through the Soto Church or the Soto organization, it really was more of a Rinzai practice, in my opinion, at least to some extent. The Rinzai people would disagree with that, but in any event, we practiced koans. Yeah, we did
Yeah.
koans. That's pretty much what we did.
Hmm.
It wasn't like weeks where we just did shikantaza and didn't work on koans.
Hmm.
When you went to a retreat or when you did interviews, it was about a koan. At least I did.
Hmm. And so when Maizumi and Glassman came back, did you start doing Dokusan with them, or did you continue on with Genpo?
Well, to some extent, yeah. What happened is, and some of this I learned afterwards, but when Maizumi and Bernie came back, a lot of people uh, were really relating to Genpo and the way he was teaching. And I think Maizumi took him off of teaching, or at least he took all the people who were working with him and gave them to Bernie instead.
Hmm.
Because, at the time, Bernie had the higher level of authorization. But I never connected with Bernie as a teacher, to be honest. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not saying he wasn't a great teacher, a lot of people did. He certainly had a lot of clarity. His talks were great. But I didn't have the feeling of that he was my teacher, and I never did really with Maizumi either.
Hmm.
So I'm a strong believer that in order to really penetrate what Zen is about, one has to have that kind of connection with the teacher, the real genuine connection, not just an intellectual one.
Hmm. And can you describe what Maizumi was like? Was he affable? Did you see much of him around?
Oh yeah, I mean, you saw him around all the time. You know, he worked in the gardens around there, and you saw him a lot. He was in the when he was in town. You know, he did a lot of the talks, and he did a lot of talks on Dogen, and he was a scholar as well as everything else, and so he did very uh, deep but also scholarly talks on Dogen and Kozan and other teachers. But he really, Dogen was probably the person that he spoke on the most, although he did, talk about some Rinzai teachers too.
Hmm. And did you know, eventually he, um, had problems with alcohol. Was there any sign of that? Was there a
Well,
party vibe
my
in the 70s
understanding
at
is
all?
it wasn't just at that time
Yeah.
that he was if he was an alcoholic, he probably was his whole life.
Hmm.
But I didn't see a lot of evidence of that, to be honest.
Hmm.
If you're not in the inner circle, which I wasn't at that time at all, because I was a younger student, I was one of the newer people. Um, I didn't see evidence of that. I mean, I did. There was occasional evidence of him drinking a lot for events and things, but everyone was drinking a lot, and most of the time, I just felt it was kind of amusing in a way. I might view it differently now, but actually, in an interesting sense, I found that I was much more able to relate to him when he was drinking than any other time,
Hmm.
because there was kind of a Japanese barrier there. The kind of uh, maybe it was because I was one of the newer people, and I don't think he was like that as much with some of the more advanced people, from what I hear talking to them, or what I heard talking to them about that afterwards.
Hmm.
But myself, and part of it was because I didn't feel a major connection with him,
Hmm.
even though I was at the center that he founded.
Hmm. Yeah. Was Joko Beck around during that time?
Yeah, Joko Beck got transmission in, I think, the last year I was there,
Hmm.
maybe 81 or 82. I mean, I was there till mid 82,
Hmm.
but I remember she got transmission, and I think I was either the first or the second person to have an interview with her after she got transmission.
Hmm.
But I knew her before that for years. She lived in San Diego, but she used to travel up there for retreats and whatever.
Hmm.
And so she was well known around there as being one of the more senior people at
Hmm.
that time.
What was she like? Was she affable? Was she?
Yeah, she was very friendly. Yeah, very friendly. I enjoyed her. I dated a woman for a while who was a pretty good friend of hers from down in San Diego. And so, there was a little bit of a connection there. And, again, there were so many people there, and most of the people I hung out with were people that were closer to my age and mentality. Andy Cooper, who lives, I believe, on the East Coast now and became a psychologist years later. He was probably one of my closest friends there. And a couple other people I used to hang out with.
Hmm. Would at that stage, when Joko give talks when in the Dokusan, like, did she work on koans with you, or was she already kind of
Yeah, at that
working
time I
that
was
way?
working on koans with her. Yeah, almost in that era, you didn't just go in and talk about what was going on. At least I never did.
Hmm.
I didn't get the feeling that that was what you could do. When I went in for an interview, it was about the koan. It was usually fairly succinct, fairly short.
Hmm.
Sometimes a little bit of follow up. In Joko's case, a little more so because I had known her before she got transmission, and so when she did, I had a few questions about it.
Hmm.
I remember asking her how she did it because she had a number of kids. She was a single parent, and she studied for 20 years. I think she started with some of the Japanese teachers.
Someone Roshi was her first, right?
Yeah, and I think she also studied with Yasutani when he used to come over before Maezumi got Dharma Transmission.
Hmm.
And I said, "Well, how did you do it?" And she said, "I think she said something like, well, I just kept my eye on the ball."
Hmm.
So, of course, now, since our school is a lay practice school, we have a lot of people like that in our school that have work and family and also manage to do the practice. But back then, wasn't you didn't see much of that. You didn't see a lot of people in that situation getting transmission in the U.S. at all.
Hmm.
Uh, she had become a monk before that, I
Hmm.
know, because Maezumi would put pressure on people to, at a certain point, even though he talked about lay practice and how important it was, he would basically put pressure on people when they became pretty senior to become a priest, to become a monk.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't think he would have given transmission to anyone who wasn't.
Hmm. What kind of ended your time there?
Uh, well, a few factors. I wasn't feeling comfortable with some of the things that were going on there. I was going through a difficult time myself, so I can't blame it on anybody else. But also, I just was kind of feeling disenchanted with what some of the things that were happening there. And
Like loose behavior, or
what?
like partying too much, or
No,
okay,
no, that was not a reason.
yeah.
Uh, No, I can't. It's hard to explain now, and I'm not sure I want to get into too much of that. But the feeling I had was that something wasn't right there. I started feeling a little too much of a cult-like feel about the what was going on there.
Hmm.
Uh, and looking back on it now, I feel it was to some extent. The
Hmm.
year after I left is when there was a big blow up, when it was discovered that he had been having relations with a lot of his students, with quite a number of students there, and so that kind of blew things up. And maybe I was feeling some of the vibe of that. I don't know, but I didn't know about any of that when I was there uh, at all. But what I was feeling is there was too much kind of cult-like behavior, in a certain sense, and so I felt like I needed to leave. And then I met someone in LA who lived on the East Coast and fell in love and ended up moving out there, and we eventually got married.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting about Maizumi. If you kind of look at his biography, you know, in a in the traditional Japanese system, when somebody gets transmission or some sort of authorization, they're not immediately kind of made teachers. There's a period of kind of integration and even further study, and then there's additional steps.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Maizumi was kind of, even he was a teacher even before he had transmission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Certainly before maybe he had it from his father, kind of, you know you know
Well, he grew up in
institutionally,
a
but certainly
Soto
before
temple.
his Incas. What's that?
Yeah, I mean, he grew up in a Soto temple. His father was
Yeah,
a pretty famous
yeah.
priest in Japan. Yeah.
And I wonder if in a lot of ways, uh, you know, the situation was just too much too quickly for him. He didn't really have a chance to mature as a practitioner before he was kind of thrust in a teaching role. And I wonder if things could have shaken out differently.
Possibly, but I don't believe that as much as a few other factors. I think, if someone's an alcoholic, they're an alcoholic, period.
Hmm.
And if someone is addicted to sex, then they're a sex addict, regardless. Um, Although one can maybe contribute to the other, I don't think it's the cause of the other.
Hmm.
But uh, I feel that part of it was the era, because
Hmm.
a lot of things, teachers did things then. Probably they did them in Japan, and no one ever found out, or certainly no one would dispute a teacher in that environment. Kind of
Hmm.
similar to how priests everywhere, Catholic priests, were not questioned up until
Hmm.
relatively recently. Um, but I also feel that Americans contribute, and Westerners in general contributed to the situation. Teachers that were came from pretty straight laced cultures in the Orient or in the East were thrown into the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And so I don't entirely blame the teachers, because I think part of it was the environment, and there was a lot of relationships going on at Zen Center of LA, not just among teachers and members or students, but among students and everything else. So it was a pretty incestuous community. I'll put it that way, and that was par for the course, I think, in that era. At
Hmm.
least that was my experience.
Hmm.
So I don't think that you can. Whereas I think addictive behavior is not excusable by anything else really. I think you can say that the era was such that people weren't called out on things because it wasn't thought of as something that couldn't happen or that was necessarily negative.
Hmm.
And I think most people these days view it in a very different light.
Hmm. So you moved to the East Coast with your wife. Did you continue your practice, or did you kind of drop out for a while?
Well, I took a break for about a year actually. I meditated on my own, not a lot, but usually in the mornings. But I really needed to detox from Zen and Zen community life after that, and and it really took me a year to do that. I really felt like like I said, I felt there were cult-like aspects of that community, probably in most Zen communities of that era, maybe some now too, even.
Hmm.
And So I spent about a year kind of evaluating things, but I was still drawn to the practice. And then I was working at a New Age journal at the time, and Rick Fields was also working there.
Hmm.
And he was a writer who wrote the book How the Swans Came to the Lake. I
Hmm.
had known him in LA because he was had practiced for a while at LA Zen Center, and it turned out I re-encountered him in Boston area, and he told me about Maureen Friedgood at the time, Roshi, who had a center in Cambridge,
Hmm.
and I'd never, other than the one or two interviews I had with Joko, I had never practiced with a woman teacher, and it kind of interested me, so I ended up practicing with that group for a while.
Were you up in New England when you moved?
Yeah, I was living in the Boston area at that time.
Mhm. And what was she like?
Uh, I really liked her a lot. And what I liked about it is, even though she was practicing a very similar Zen to what I was used to,
Hmm.
in terms of the format, it was almost identical. She didn't really, I think she maybe did some koan work with people, but she was Soen's student, and I don't think Soen Roshi worked with koans, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that, but anyway, she did a little koan work. It wasn't the major emphasis, but having a female Zen presence and Zen influence was really exactly what I needed at that time. There was kind of a softness to it that didn't exist in the practices I'd had before. Instead of using a kyosaku on people's shoulders, she'd go around and massage people's shoulders during the sitting to relax the shoulders, which I thought was really cool. And I just really liked her vibe and her energy and the way she talked.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
And was this kind of, did she have a center, or was this kind of living room
Yeah,
set,
she had a
or?
center in Cambridge, a big giant house in Cambridge. And because it was in a very upscale, very wealthy neighborhood and it wasn't technically zoned for that, they didn't have any signs out front. They didn't do any advertising.
Hmm.
Uh, and you couldn't even park around there. You had to park a few blocks away when you came and did things.
Right.
They didn't want to draw attention to what they were doing there, I don't think.
Hmm.
But there was a pretty vital community there. Not a large community, but very nice.
Hmm. Were there live-in residences, or was it all kind of lay people showing up from their jobs and
I
lives?
think she was the only one that lived there. I'm
Hmm.
not even sure she lived there at that time, to be honest.
Hmm.
But no, it wasn't a living community. Yeah, it was a place where people came and practiced.
Hmm. And did you stay there until she got ill, or did you
Say
leave
that
before that?
again.
Did you stay there until she got sick,
Oh
or,
no, no, no! I was gone long before that. I was only in that area about a year, so I practiced with her about a year, and then I moved out to Western Massachusetts,
Mhm.
and then things went in different directions then. So I don't think I ever saw her again after that either.
Mhm. What was the next major step in your Zen career at that point?
Well, when I moved out to Western Massachusetts, and I ended up, because I wanted to sit with people, and there wasn't anything going on in that town at the time that,
Mhm.
at least that I could find, that really drew me in. I decided to start a sitting group myself, and Dido John Dido Laurie, who had Zen Mountain Monastery out at near Woodstock in Mount
Mhm.
Tremper, New York. Again, I knew him from LA also from my previous years, and I'd gone out there and done a few retreats when I first moved to the area,
Mhm.
to the Northampton area, Northampton Amherst area in Western Mass. his center was about, I'm going to say, a few hours, maybe 2.5 hours from where I lived. So it wasn't a long drive. And Andy Cooper, who at that time I believe was already starting to write for Tricycle or some of the other Buddhist magazines, he lived there with his girlfriend, and so I went out to visit him, and ended up hanging out with them and Dido to some extent. And I did probably over the course of a few years, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 retreats there, session there.
Mhm.
And then, so I invited Dido to come out and do a talk in Northampton, where I was living, Northampton, Massachusetts. And he came and did a talk. We had about 20, 25 people show up. And then at the end of the workshop or talk he did, I said I was going to start a sitting group. And if anyone was interested, let me know. And I had about 10 or 12 people say, yes, we want to do it. So that was the start of what became the Northampton Zen group.
Mhm.
And so I didn't have any teaching authority per se. I wasn't teaching koans or anything like that at the time,
Mhm.
but I had been practicing a number of years already, so I felt pretty confident at least setting up and running the sitting group.
Mhm.
And I did that for about, I'm going to say about a decade or so.
Mhm. And you would travel to Mount Temper to do sessions with Dido.
Yeah, I did, but again, I never felt Dido was more a contemporary of mine at that time, and so I didn't feel a teacher connection with him, even though he was, I think, further along in koan study at that time than I was.
Mhm.
But I liked going and sitting there because it was a beautiful place, and
Mhm.
they had a very nice, very strong sesshin there. But then what happened is a few years after that, I found out that Genpo, who's now Genpo Sensei, had come back from Europe where he was for a while,
Mhm.
and had a center in Bar Harbor, Maine.
Mhm.
And so I started traveling up there, and I reconnected with him, and that kind of got me going with that teacher again.
So you'd gone maybe 10 years without working on, going through the koan curriculum at that
No,
point.
no, I was working on koans with Dido, and then
Oh,
when,
okay.
yeah, no, I was working on koans the whole time.
Mhm. Yeah. And so you reconnected with Genpo. Did you move up to be closer with him, or did you just
No, I never moved up there, but I went up and did quite a few retreats up
mhm.
there, including a month long one that we did at the first month long retreat I did with Kozan Roshi, which was his group, was in this town in southern Maine.
Mhm. And eventually he made you an assistant teacher, is that correct?
Yeah, that didn't happen until years later. He ended up going from
Okay.
Bar Harbor to Salt Lake City, kind of
Hmm.
by a circuitous route. And I reconnected with him
Hmm.
again in Salt Lake, and I did move to Salt Lake City
Hmm.
in the late '90s. When was it? Like '96, I think.
Hmm.
And that's when I kind of really got immersed in studying with him for about 4 or 5 years.
Hmm.
And I became the first lay person that he gave Hoshi to, which was kind of the official assistant teacher status.
So have you never ordained?
Never ordained. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Actually, he came up with a with a um, category. He called it life vows, which was a lay equivalent to taking Tokudo. So I was kind of the guinea pig. I was the first one to do that in his organization.
Hmm.
So I did another month long retreat there where I was Shuso for that month, which meant that I was kind of the training master who ran the retreat,
Hmm.
and similar to what a monk does when they become a senior monk.
Hmm.
And then at the end of that retreat, you do your first official talk, and then you receive that assistant teacher status. I think he did that shortly after that.
And had you ever taken Jukai to that point?
Yeah, I took Jukai years before that. I took Jukai with Maezumi Roshi in 1980.
Hmm.
And yeah, and then that life vows I did in I'm gonna say 1998, something like that.
Hmm. So did you move on from Genpo, or? what was the next steps there?
Yeah, I stopped when I moved out to Florida in 2001,
Hmm.
and I continued studying with him for about a year after I moved out here, maybe a year and a half, and then I realized that I wanted to move in a different direction, and decided to stop working with him as
Hmm.
a teacher.
Hmm. And then you worked with Shuzen Roshi, is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you know him? How did you guys
Well,
hook up?
I knew him from Genpo's group in Salt Lake City, and
Hmm.
he moved to Philadelphia, and he left Genpo, I think, about a year or two after I did, and so we were good friends in Salt Lake. We spent a lot of time together, so there was a lot of kind of camaraderie. And I used to go up to Philly, and we would spend time up there, and I kind of helped him a little bit in certain regards. And then after he got Dharma Transmission, he a few years later he gave me Dharma Transmission after going through a couple years of requirements that he had.
Hmm. And he's in Bernie Glassman Roshi's lineage, is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, did you so you worked through a couple of different of the White Plum kind of
Mhm.
branches. Were they all pretty similar to each other, or did they all have their different flavors? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, all the teachers have a different flavor, of course,
Mhm.
but the curriculum was essentially the same, the
Mhm.
same koan. So it was easy for me to pick up with one teacher where the other one let off.
Mhm.
Uh,
And yeah, and so then would the next step be you starting the Open Mind Zen after
yeah, well, what
transition?
happened is after I decided to break with Genpo,
Mhm.
uh, right around that time, I'd started a group here in Florida when I moved here. In fact, it was one of the reasons that we decided to move to this particular area, is there wasn't already a Zen group in this town.
Mhm.
And I had started a group similar to what I did in Western Massachusetts. It was a sitting group primarily.
Mhm.
And but at that point, I had finished koan study, and so I started doing some koans with people, even though I wasn't fully transmitted, which is
Mhm.
not entirely kosher, in most Zen circles. But then again, I had practiced at that point more. I'd already been practicing for 30 years at that point, so which
Mhm.
was longer than most people who were teachers at the time, or many of them anyway. So there wasn't a lot of argument about that. But then I realized later on that it would make sense to go the route of getting Dharma transmission to become kind of get the official
Mhm.
imprimatur.
Mhm. And so with that, was it called the Open Mind Zen Center at that point?
Yeah, yeah. I founded Open Mind Zen in, I think, 2002, and
Mhm.
then I think we incorporated as a nonprofit in 2004 or five.
Mhm.
Um, and shortly after we moved out here, I bought a building, which was our first building,
Mhm.
meditation center's first building,
Mhm.
and not too long after that, donated that building to the nonprofit organization, and then we're now in our third building in this town.
Mhm. And then in '08 you got Dharma transition, is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so at this point, there's no clericalism at all. You guys are all lay people, training lay people.
Well, we're not all lay people. I have some students who are
Oh,
ordained.
that's right. Yeah.
Um, my first person I transmitted to, Linda Nyoki Lerhop, she had also been a student of Genpo's, and she'd run Kanzeon Sangha in Germany for a decade. She's actually American, but she married a German man
Hmm.
and speaks fluent German and been over there many years. She's still over there, actually. In fact, I'm going there to do some work with her Zen group in early June.
Hmm.
But uh, I can't remember your question though.
Oh, just the type of lay practice versus
Oh, the lay
clericalism. Yeah.
practice. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, Linda had already been ordained as a priest, as a monk by Genpo,
Hmm.
and so, but living really as a lay person, which I basically consider a lay person, to be honest. I do. Not everyone does, but I do.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my students now have gotten Dharma transmission. I mean, well, some of them have gotten Dharma transmission in other lineages, but not, I would say 4 or 5 of them have been ordained in other Buddhist traditions,
Mm-hmm.
other Zen traditions or other traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they all live as lay people, and the key thing for me is anyone who wants to become a student of mine, whether they're ordained or not, doesn't matter to me. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that I don't think I would train them if they weren't open to transmitting to a lay person, even though they're ordained.
Mm-hmm.
So if they weren't interested in that, I don't think I would want to be their teacher, because I have a very strong feeling about lay practice, the importance of it.
Yeah.
And so our Open Mind Zen is a lay practice organization, although some of my students are ordained. So that's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, I think the ordained versus lay dichotomy is less meaningful than maybe residential practice versus householder practice in a lot of ways, because there's residential people who are lay, and there's residential people who are ordained, and then there's householders that are ordained and householders that are lay. So it seems, would you agree or disagree that kind of the residential training versus householder training is maybe the bigger demarcation?
I don't know. It depends what you call demarcation, but there's definitely a lot of different things going on. And so I'm a member of 3 different Zen teaching organizations: the White Plum Asangha, the American Zen Teachers Association, and the Lay Zen Teachers Association. Mm-hmm. And the LZTA, the Lay Zen Teachers Association, is really the only one I'm real active in. I'm actually the secretary treasurer currently. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we had trouble doing, because I was with them, I didn't find out about it the first year they were in existence, but I did after the first meeting they had, and I've been a member ever since. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of trouble defining what a layperson was in the context of American Zen, because there's so many different varieties of practice going on. There's, exactly as you say, there's people that are lay, that are really training as kind of the way priests or monks would. There are people who are ordained that are really living as lay people, and everything in between. And honestly, until I got involved with that organization, and this was after 40 years of Zen practice, and traveling and knowing a lot of people in the field, I had no idea that much variety existed in our country. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I don't know if I would affirm what you said, but I would say that there's a lot going on, and one has to decide for oneself what the best way to practice is. But one thing's for sure, there's a lot of different variations happening of all different varieties. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of discovering for oneself what works for each individual.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked, but I remember one time looking at the criteria just because I was curious. And one of the bullet points was that you as a teacher, you don't offer priest ordination to your students, I think, unless I'm misremembering. And I
don't think you can if you're a lay person.
Well, you could be, because I think an earlier bullet point is you can be a priest, but you're open to training lay people, right?
Yeah, I think if you look at the definition on the site, it's that you have to be willing to transmit to lay people. Mm-hmm. And your primary, I think, basically there's a difference also between, there's a priest, there's a monk, there's ordaining means different things in different Buddhist traditions, and certainly even within Zen. And like I said, it's very hard to determine what a lay person is at times, Yeah. And for me anyway, just all I can speak to is within our organization, I don't really care whether someone's ordained or not in terms of whether they're a student of mine, just that they do the work get into it, what we do, and that we have the relationship that's necessary. But one of the few requirements I do have is that they be open to and be willing to transmit to a lay person, because otherwise it's not a lay lineage. Then it's dependent upon ordination. And that was what I really I saw the purpose of it, and within Soto Zen especially, it's paramount, and they're still wrestling with that. To be
Mhm,
honest, in Soto Zen, whether to ordain, whether to transmit fully to lay people,
mhm,
uh, like San Francisco Zen Center, which is the biggest American Soto Zen organization, I'm sure.
mhm.
There's most of the teachers there still don't do that. It was only
Yeah.
recently that started happening in some cases. So that's something I wanted to run counter to. And in our instance, in our school's instance, I feel that family practice, work practice, even recreation practice is essential to becoming
Mhm,
a well-rounded Zen practitioner.
mhm. It seems, having done residential Zen practice myself and then done most of my practice as a lay householder, so to speak, the biggest difference is your ability to do sashins, I found.
Mm.
If you're in the midst of your career and you have young kids, and when I was in that stage of my life, I mean, I probably went 4 or 5 years without doing a single
Mhm.
session, from age 0 to 5 years old or 6 years
Mhm.
old for my kids. I
Yeah,
just going away for a week just was
yeah,
beyond
it
a
is
possibility.
difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult, which is why I think it's important that structures be set up for people to
Hmm.
do practice that are in that situation, which I
Hmm.
feel we do.
Hmm.
In my own, I agree with you there. In my own case, because I had my own business and it was cyclical. There were times when I was on and times when I was off because I
Hmm.
produced events that
Hmm.
happened 3 times a year. I had large amounts of time where I was able to do that. We only had one child, and so it was a burden, I think, somewhat on my ex-wife, but
Hmm.
it was possible, and so I did several month-long retreats during that time,
Great.
and
And
a number of week-long ones too. But it was so I was able to do what probably most lay people can't do unless they're retired and living at a center or a
right.
resident, like you're talking about.
Okay. Um, so you were one of the first, if not the first, teachers in America to do koan studies through, I don't know if Zoom existed at the time, but
It
that type
didn't.
of interface. Is
No,
that
it
correct?
was. Yeah, I started out using before Skype. I started out using email and phone calling,
Hmm.
but with a few people, and then once video conferencing became available, and then I started doing that.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I probably was one of the early people doing that. Not
Hmm.
everyone agreed with it either at the
Did you
time.
get some pushback on it?
Yeah, because and a lot of teachers, I don't know about a lot, but there are certainly teachers that still believe this, that the face-to-face meeting in person
Hmm.
would be the only way they believed you could really determine whether someone can pass a koan or whatever. I certainly don't believe that now. I didn't believe it then either.
Hmm.
But I really don't believe it now because I've seen the contrary for a number of years now.
Hmm.
And then, there was the issue of just because there's video conferencing doesn't mean people's computers and modems and all that can handle it, especially early on. It was really tough. And even these days, sometimes it is.
Hmm.
But, but it's certainly much better now in terms of the transmission quality and all that.
Hmm. And so the downsides are, maybe you're missing some of the face-to-face, kind of chemistry that people can feel. But it seems like, would you agree that the major advantage is it gives people with geographically diverse areas the chance to do that kind of training? Do you see any other
Oh,
advantages?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it gives people that don't live in the town that the teacher's in the opportunity to study with someone they feel an affinity with, even if there
Hmm.
are centers in the town that they are in. I mean,
Hmm.
that's the case for a number of my students.
Hmm.
There are Zen centers in the town they're in some cases, but they don't feel an affinity with those teachers
Hmm.
or those particular forms of practice, and they do with what we do. And I'm sure there are people who feel just the opposite about us. And it's not saying everyone feels that way about me or anything,
Hmm.
but the people who become students do. So,
And your retreats are still in person though, right? I don't
mhm.
remember seeing any online retreats that you've advertised. Is that
We
correct?
did a few day-long online retreats, but I really I didn't encourage it after a few because honestly, I do so much Zooming anyway that the idea of sitting in front of a screen for an entire day multiple times was just more than I could handle.
Mhm.
So we didn't do a lot of retreats during that time.
Do you have an expectation that your students that are either transmitted or working towards it, that they come out and sit with you in person for the sessions, or are you,
Yeah,
or,
yeah, at least some, yeah.
yeah.
It depends what their previous experience has been to some extent, and also where else they may practice.
Mhm.
I don't have an ego attachment to people only practicing with me.
Mhm.
Although if they're working on koans, I wouldn't want them to do that with anybody else. It's too difficult to do that, I think,
Mhm.
other than someone in our school. But in terms of doing a retreat, I actually encourage people to do retreats with other teachers or schools.
Mhm.
So I have no problem with that.
Mhm.
But yeah, they do have to do some with me unless they, well, some with me definitely, and a fair amount with me unless they are doing it somewhere else or have done it in their past,
Mhm.
which a lot of people that come to me now are fairly advanced. In some cases, you know, have extensive training with other teachers or other schools and want to do koans with me.
Mhm.
And so those people, the requirements are different because of the amount of training they've done.
Mhm. Could you talk a little bit about the Zen dialogue work that you do?
Mhm. Um, yeah, well, I first started training in this work with Genpo Roshi in Salt Lake City, and he had studied with Hal Stone,
Mhm.
he and his wife were the originators of the voice dialogue technique, and he came up with this synthesis of voice dialogue and Zen, which he called Zen dialogue originally, and then he changed the name of it, what he was doing, to the Big Mind workshop.
Mhm.
And when I moved out here, I was really, I always had a real affinity with that work. I just immediately, the first time I did a workshop in it that he led, I was just floored by what happened in that work. And that was after, at that point, I had been practicing Zen for probably 25 years before that. So it wasn't like I was a newbie. But just some of the things that came out in that work were things that I felt were amazingly clarifying. So I've always felt an affinity with it. And so I've been using it for like about 25 years now. And in recent years, I go through cycles of doing more of it or less of it. I've done Zen dialogue retreats where we do a lot of the dialogue work in addition to sitting, and also separate workshops. And then I went for years without doing a lot of it. And then during the pandemic, I started doing it more with people online, individually online, which I hadn't actually ever done before through Zoom. And now I'm kind of in another phase where I'm much more into it now.
Mhm. So, could you give like a brief description of what it actually is? Is it like
Mhm.
guided meditation? Does it have imagery? Like
Mhm.
what actually is it?
Yeah. Um, well, Hal Stone's work with voice dialogue was based originally on Gestalt therapy, but he and Sidra, his wife, came up with this method or this viewpoint of viewing the self, the greater self, not
Mhm.
just the ego part of the self, as uh, you might call it a colony of different selves rather than one unitary self.
Mhm.
And uh, so we viewing ourselves as a kind of a group of voices. I call them voices or selves. We can use either term. Let's use the word voice right now. So there are different voices, and these voices are often competing. In other words, we can have a voice that wants us to do a part of ourself that is based on our prior conditioning that
Mhm.
leads us to act in a certain way, and then a part that's more awakened that leads us to act in an entirely different way. And sometimes those parts are at loggerheads with each other, and uh, and so the dialogue work is designed to help us identify what the parts of the self are that are um, being employed, so to speak,
Mhm.
in our daily life, in our relationships, and in our actions,
Mhm.
and determining why they're functioning the way they are, and then clarifying, bringing unconscious activity or unconscious, what Hal Stone called disowned parts of the self, into conscious owning or consciousness. So it's a matter. So basically, what I feel Zen is making the unconscious conscious, and the dialogue work is a very effective way of doing that in a different way through dialogue rather than through just meditation and koans or whatever. Well, koans are a form of dialogue, of course.
Yeah. Do you see, like, where do you think it fits in along the Zen path? Or maybe this is over reductionistic, but is it something best done, prior to koan work or along with it? Is it something you do
That's a
multiple
good question.
times?
Well, I do it with virtually all of my new students before they start, or around the time they start doing koan work, unless they're quite experienced in koans already, which again, some people are. They've done a lot of koan work with other teachers or other Zen groups or Zen lineages. But I prefer doing it with all my new students because I think it does give them a real sense of what koans are pointing towards. But a lot of the people that I've worked with over the years, they do the work periodically, either individually or in groups that I've run or the retreats that I've done, because there's always more stuff to work with. There's always more parts of ourselves that are revealing themselves, and sometimes certain buttons get pushed and things get activated even after many years of practice that surprise us. And so it's a way of effectively working with those parts.
Great. So if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
They can either, they can check our website, openmindzen.com. They can email us at openmindzen@aol.com. That's a good way to get in touch.
Okay, great.
Yeah, our website's got most of the information, on what we're doing. We don't do long retreats. We're just not set up to do that. We don't have a space to do that, but we do have a practice center in Melbourne, Florida, which is kind of that's where I live. We also have one in Naples, Florida, an affiliate. We have two in Indiana, Bloomington and Columbus, Indiana, run by Frank Diaz, who I gave transmission to last year. We have a brand new group in Louisville, Kentucky.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we just started actually, run by a student of mine, who's a fairly new student of mine, but someone who's been practicing quite a while.
And who is that?
What?
Who is that?
Angie Garner.
Okay.
She's an artist who owns several art galleries, and a professional artist, and also been a Zen practitioner for a number of years. So that one actually just started recently. And we also have Linda Lehrhaupt, who's in France and Germany, who teaches there, my first Dharma successor. And we have a small group in Washington, D.C., led by Robert Epstein, sensei. And then we also have a couple other groups that are not Open Mind Zen affiliates, but are associated with our center still. So.
And you guys do run sessions is it an ashram or something like that?
Yeah, we use a Kashmir Ashram, which is a beautiful yoga ashram about half an hour south of us here in Melbourne. It's in a town called Sebastian, Florida. Very nice place to have close by, and we've been running retreats there for about 11 or 12 years now. So we do two 3-4 day retreats a year at that location, and then we do during non-COVID times, and we're just getting back into it now. We do regular one-day sittings at our center here in Melbourne, Florida, and then the other affiliate centers do their own programs. There's Open Mind Zen Indiana, they have their own programs. Open Mind Zen Naples, Florida, they do their own programs also.
For the one days, do people who don't live in the area, can they Zoom in and participate, or is that
well, we haven't yet. Well, it's interesting you asked that, because we've just finished wiring up the center here to be able to send and receive Zoom in our Zendo. So we will be able to do that, very soon. In fact, we have a retreat going on the 23rd, which is a one-day retreat. And I think that Sensei Dave, who will be running that one, I won't be running that one, may do that, actually. I hadn't talked to him about that, but we're just starting to, for the last couple of weeks, we've been able to Zoom, at our center, because we just got it all set up recently.
Mhm. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Love to have you
All right.
back someday.
Thanks. I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.